You know, every now and then, something happens that brings back one of my mother's old lessons from our little Midwest town. She'd say, "Son, trouble rarely arrives wearing the same clothes twice." And as I listen to people compare today's worries to 2008, I can't help thinking, we're watching the wrong storm. We're looking for falling home prices and stock charts drowning in red. But what if the danger this time isn't the kind we've lived through before? What if it's quieter, deeper, and far more unsettling? I've seen more economic scares than I can count, but what's taking shape now feels different. Not just a downturn, but a shift in the rules themselves. Think back to 2008. We all remember it. Grim anchors on TV, neighbors whispering in grocery aisles, retirement accounts shrinking overnight. That crisis scarred us. But it was, in many ways, a deflationary crash. Prices fell. The dollar got stronger. Cash was king. Painful, yes. But the system eventually reset. What's coming now is the mirror opposite. This isn't a crisis where assets collapse. It's one where the money collapses. The foundation we measure value with, the dollars in our wallets and banks. That's what's under threat. And that, my friends, is a very different kind of storm. I remember my father telling me about his parents in the Depression. But what's forming now doesn't look like the 1930s. It looks more like the crises we used to shake our heads at. Places where people needed bundles of cash just to buy bread. I'm not saying that's coming tomorrow, but the direction we're heading, it rhymes a little too closely for comfort. And the real danger isn't in the markets we can see. It's in the foundation beneath them. Think of past crashes, 2008, the dot-com bust. Those were fires in individual rooms of the house. The housing room burned. The tech room burned. But the house itself, the foundation, remained intact. This time, the cracks are in the foundation. Our entire financial system rests on trust. Trust that a dollar today will still be worth a dollar tomorrow, that government debt is safe, that the whole structure isn't just a house of cards. That trust is eroding, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Once you see that, you understand why what's coming could be far more painful than 2008. Let me paint the picture. In this kind of crisis, your home value might rise. The stock market might hit new records. Your account balances might look bigger than ever. And you might think you're getting wealthier. But those bigger numbers, they're an illusion. They're not measuring stronger assets. They're measuring weaker dollars. It's like using a measuring tape that stretches as you use it. The numbers go up, but the inches shrink. That's why some people call this a reverse crash. Prices rise, but purchasing power evaporates. And if the crash isn't in asset prices, then where is it? It's in the thing we've always been told is safest, government bonds and the currency behind them. For generations, U.S. Treasuries were the bedrock, the risk-free corner of every portfolio. But what if the world's safest asset has quietly become its most dangerous? Here's how we got here. Every recession, every crisis, every political promise, Washington solved it by borrowing more, and the Federal Reserve printed more to buy that debt. It was a miracle cure with no visible side effects. But the side effects didn't disappear. They were simply postponed. Imagine a family that fixes every problem with a new credit card. Car breaks, new card, medical bill, new card. Eventually, they're not borrowing to get ahead. They're borrowing just to make minimum payments. That's where we are now. We've built a mountain of debt so massive there's no historical comparison. And we're no longer borrowing for roads, schools, or investments in the future. We're borrowing trillions each year just to keep the lights on and pay the interest on what we already owe. And sooner or later, those IOUs come due. In a healthy financial system, when the government needs to borrow money, investors around the world line up to lend it. Foreign governments, pension funds, ordinary savers, they all buy our bonds because they trust they'll be repaid. But here's the warning sign that keeps me up at night. That line is getting shorter. So, who is buying all the new debt we keep issuing? More and more, it's the Federal Reserve itself, our own central bank, printing money to buy the government's IOUs. That's not sustainable. It's like writing yourself a check and calling it income, a closed loop, a snake eating its own tail, and it only works as long as everyone believes in it. When that belief cracks, we enter what economists call a sovereign debt crisis, which is just a polite way of saying the government can't pay its bills. And when Washington can't pay through taxes or honest borrowing, it reaches for the final tool left. It prints money. not to help the economy, but to pay its own debts with newly created dollars. That's the moment inflation stops being a nuisance and becomes something far uglier. It's the moment rising prices turn into currency failure, where money doesn't just lose value, it loses the trust that gives it value at all. Academics call it hyperinflation. Regular people experience it as their life savings melting away. I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm trying to help you see clearly, and the signs of this unraveling are already around us. Have you noticed how the stock market has become strangely concentrated? A handful of giant tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, now make up more than a third of the S&P 500. Traditional analysts say tech is strong, but through the lens of a currency crisis, you see something different. People no longer trust cash. They're hiding in these massive corporations as if they're fortresses. And it's not just tech. Look at gold, breaking records. Look at Bitcoin, surging. Look at fine art, collectibles, anything scarce. People are paying extraordinary prices. Traditional theory says these are separate bubbles, but when the currency is the bubble, this behavior makes perfect sense. What do these assets have in common? Scarcity. You can't print more gold. Bitcoin's supply is fixed. You can't mint another Picasso. In a world drowning in printable money, scarcity becomes the one thing people trust. This isn't mania. It's people heading for the lifeboats, grabbing anything real, anything the printing press can't dilute. Some people understand exactly what they're doing. Others just feel something is wrong with holding cash. And the strange truth is this: the irrational act isn't buying scarce assets. The irrational act is holding cash and believing you're safe. And the signs of this flight are everywhere, if we're willing to look. But nowhere is it more painful or more personal than in the American housing market. I hear it from folks our age all the time. Their grandkids, nieces, nephews, good young people with solid jobs, simply can't afford a home. They're stuck renting, paying someone else's mortgage, unable to build the equity our generation took for granted. They're angry. They feel cheated out of the American dream. And the hard truth is, they're right. They are being cheated, but not in the way they think. Most are waiting for a 2008-style crash, saving up and hoping that if they're patient, prices will finally fall. But that crash isn't coming, not the way they expect. The housing market has been shaped, distorted, and inflated by decades of policies that pushed it far beyond anything resembling a real market. Let me explain how we got here. For generations, the government tried to make housing more affordable by guaranteeing mortgages through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Noble idea, terrible outcome. By removing lender risk, the government encouraged banks to lend to anyone on terms that made no sense. And all that cheap credit didn't make homes cheaper. It just pushed prices higher. More buyers with more borrowed money chasing the same number of houses. It's like an auction where everyone suddenly gets handed an extra $10,000. The items don't become cheaper, the bids just go up. Then the tax code turbocharged the distortion. If you bought a home, you could deduct your mortgage interest. If you rented, you got nothing. So millions took on enormous debt, not because it was the smart choice, but because the government made it feel foolish not to. This wasn't a free market. This was social engineering, and then came the pandemic. In 2020, the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero to keep the economy afloat. Homeowners rushed to refinance. People paying 4 or 5% locked in rates of 2 or 3%. Monthly payments dropped. For individual families, it felt like a blessing. But system-wide, it created something far more dangerous. Golden handcuffs. Right now, mortgage rates sit around 6 to 8%. But millions of families are locked into mortgages at 2.5% or 3%. On a $300,000 home, that's a payment around $300 a month. Try to move, try to buy again at today's rates, that payment could double. And so, people don't move. They can't move. They're trapped, tethered to homes they might have outgrown, anchored to cities they might otherwise leave. This is how a market freezes. This is how a generation gets shut out. And this is why the hope for a housing crash, some miraculous return to affordability, is a false hope. Because the roots of this crisis are baked into the system itself. If you sell your home and try to buy a new one at today's prices, which haven't come down, and finance it at 7 or 8%, your payment doesn't inch up. It doubles. It triples. For many families, it's not just difficult. It's impossible. So people stay put. They don't move, even when their lives change, even when they want to. They can't afford to give up those rock-bottom pandemic mortgages. And that's created something we've never seen before, a massive long-term inventory freeze. Millions of homes are effectively locked out of the market and will stay that way for years. With supply this tight, prices stay high even as affordability collapses. It's a paradox. In any normal market, rising rates mean falling prices. But this market isn't normal. The supply side is paralyzed. So when young people tell me they're waiting for a 2008 crash, I feel for them. Because I don't think that crash is coming. Not in the dollar numbers on the listing. The real crash is already here. It's an affordability crash. The price measured against wages, against cost of living, against a family's ability to buy, that's what's collapsing. Meanwhile, housing becomes a store of value in an inflationary world. Wealthier investors buy real estate not because they need a home, but because they need protection from a weakening dollar. Housing stops being a ladder for families and becomes a fortress, and most people are standing outside the wall. But this frozen housing market isn't just a social crisis. It's a direct threat to the banking system. Because those golden handcuffs trapping homeowners, they're the same chains dragging banks underwater. And that brings us to one of the most dangerous and least understood parts of this entire situation: the quiet insolvency spreading through the banking sector. Most of us grew up believing banks were the bedrock, safe, stable, sensible. In 2008, banks failed because of bad loans. Borrowers defaulted, banks lost money, and the system cracked. But today's crisis is far more insidious. Banks aren't losing money on bad loans. They're losing money on good ones. Let me explain. During the pandemic, banks issued millions of mortgages at 2 or 3%. Those mortgages look fine on paper. Borrowers are paying on time. But the bank's cost of money, the rate they pay depositors, other banks, and the Federal Reserve, is now 5% or more. They're earning 2% and paying 5%. Every good mortgage bleeds them a little more each month, and they're locked into these low-rate loans for decades. It's like owning a rental property that costs you more than you collect in rent, every month forever. And it's not just mortgages. Banks were pushed into buying what were supposed to be the safest assets in the world: U.S. Treasury bonds. For years, those bonds paid almost nothing, 1%, 0.5%. But regulators required banks to hold them. Then the Fed raised rates, fast. And the value of those older low-rate bonds collapsed. Why buy a 2% bond at full price when you can buy a new one paying 5%? So banks now sit on hundreds of billions, possibly trillions, in losses on assets once considered bulletproof. On paper, many are effectively insolvent. So why aren't banks failing all over the place? Because of an accounting rule called hold to maturity. It allows banks to pretend those underwater bonds are worth full value, as long as they don't sell them. The losses are unrealized, invisible, ignored. They only become real if the bank is forced to raise cash. This is the quiet crisis, hidden in plain sight, written in footnotes the average person never sees. But here's the question that should keep us all up at night. What happens when depositors get nervous and want their money back? What happens when there's a loss of confidence, even a small one, and customers start withdrawing their savings? The bank has to sell those bonds to raise cash. And the moment they sell, those unrealized losses become very painfully realized. The bank's insolvency, which was always there, just hidden, becomes visible to everyone. This isn't theoretical. This is exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank in early 2023. You probably remember the headlines: 16th largest bank in America, gone in 48 hours. And what killed it? Not risky tech loans, not fraud, not subprime mortgages. What killed it was safe government bonds that had lost value when interest rates rose. When depositors got nervous and started pulling their money, the bank had to sell those bonds at a loss. And once the losses became public, it was a race to the exits. The bank collapsed not over weeks or months, but in a single weekend. And here's what should terrify us. Silicon Valley Bank wasn't an outlier. It wasn't uniquely reckless or poorly managed. It was doing exactly what most banks were doing, what they were supposed to do according to the rules, which means the same vulnerabilities exist across the entire system. We have too many banks that are too big to fail, but also too big to mark to market, meaning too big to acknowledge the real losses on their books. The whole system is a house of cards that stays standing only as long as nobody pulls out a card, only as long as confidence holds. And confidence is the most fragile thing in finance. This all leads to one unavoidable dilemma, the central bank trap. Now, I've spent enough years watching the Federal Reserve to know that they are staffed by very smart people. They understand economics. They run sophisticated models. They're not ignorant of what's happening. But here's the hard truth. They're trapped, and there's no way out that doesn't involve serious pain. Let me lay out the dilemma as simply as I can. Option 1. The Federal Reserve keeps interest rates high to fight inflation. On the surface, this sounds responsible. Inflation is eating away at people's purchasing power, so fight it with higher rates, slow down borrowing, cool off the economy, bring prices under control. But here's the problem with that approach. The U.S. government is carrying an absolutely staggering debt load. We're talking north of $30 trillion, and that number keeps growing. Every time interest rates go up, the cost of servicing that debt goes up dramatically. The government has to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. At a certain point, and we may already be there, the interest payments become unsustainable. The government faces a choice between defaulting on its obligations or printing money to cover them. Either path leads to a collapse in confidence in U.S. bonds and the dollar itself. So, option 1, keep rates high, leads to government insolvency and a bond market crisis. Option 2, the Federal Reserve lowers rates again, tries to ease the burden, maybe claims they've beaten inflation even when they haven't. This would relieve pressure on the government's debt payments. It would help banks that are underwater on their low-rate assets. It would prop up the housing market. Sounds better, right? Except it would be throwing gasoline on an already raging inflationary fire. Lower rates would signal to the entire world that the Federal Reserve has given up, that they are prioritizing keeping the government solvent over protecting the value of the currency. It would be an admission that they're willing to inflate away the debt, and in the process, inflate away everyone's savings. That path leads directly to runaway inflation, potentially hyperinflation, and the destruction of the dollar's purchasing power. So option 2, lower rates, leads to currency collapse. Rock and a hard place. Insolvency or hyperinflation. Government default or currency destruction. There is no third option. There is no soft landing. There is no clever policy trick that threads the needle and saves us from both outcomes. The Federal Reserve, for all its power, for all its PhDs and models and fancy tools, is out of moves. They're like a chess player who can see the checkmate coming, but can't find any move that prevents it. And when the public finally wakes up to this reality, when confidence breaks, we enter the final phase. Because, you see, money isn't really about paper. It never has been. Money is trust. It's a collective agreement that these pieces of paper, these numbers in a computer, represent value that we can exchange for real goods and real services. It's a shared belief, a social contract. Government bonds aren't assets. They're promises. Promises that the government will pay you back with interest, in money that still has value when the time comes. When trust in those promises dies, when people stop believing in the value of the currency, no amount of government intervention can revive it. No speech by the president, no emergency action by the Fed, no new policy or program can force people to believe in something they've lost faith in. And when trust goes, we enter the final phase, the great transition of wealth. This moment we're heading toward. I want to be very clear about this. It's not just a financial event. It's not just a recession or even a depression. It's a fundamental restructuring of who owns what. It's the most significant redistribution of wealth and property we're likely to see in our lifetimes. And the winners and losers are already being determined right now by the choices people are making. The losers, I'm sad to say, will be the people who did everything they were told to do, the people who followed all the rules, who worked hard, who saved diligently, who were prudent and conservative with their money. They'll be the ones holding cash, thinking it's safe. Retirees on fixed incomes and pensions, the monthly checks will still arrive, but they'll buy less and less each month. Conservative investors who put their nest eggs into government bonds because they were told those were risk-free, They'll watch the value evaporate. The middle class, the savers, people our age who built a lifetime of security, we're watching it all get inflated away. Not stolen suddenly by some dramatic event, but quietly eroded, like a beach disappearing grain by grain with each wave. Their safety, the very prudence they were praised for, will turn out to have been the greatest risk of all. Now, who will come out ahead? Who will survive or even thrive in this transition? It'll be the people who understood that the game had changed, the ones who recognize that when the currency itself is the bubble, you need to get your wealth out of currency and into things that can't be printed. The holders of gold and silver, those ancient stores of value that governments can't create with a printing press. The early adopters of Bitcoin and other decentralized digital assets, scarce non-sovereign money that exists outside the traditional system. The owners of productive farmland and real estate, if they've managed their debt carefully. The owners of real businesses that produce actual goods and services people need. Businesses that can adjust their prices as currency devalues. These people aren't smarter or better. They just recognized the nature of the crisis earlier and positioned accordingly. Now, I know this all sounds heavy. I know it might feel overwhelming or even frightening. And that's not my intent. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to help you see clearly. Because here's what I've learned in all my years watching American politics and economics. We've been through hard times before. We've faced existential challenges. We've walked through valleys that seemed dark and impossible. And we've come out the other side, changed but enduring. This transition will be painful. It will be disruptive. A lot of people will be hurt by it. But it's not the end of the world. It's the end of a particular system, a particular way of organizing our economy that was built on unsustainable foundations. And understanding what's happening gives you a fighting chance. It lets you make informed decisions. It allows you to protect what you've built to the extent that's possible, and to help your children and grandchildren navigate what's coming. So, what does all this mean for us, ordinary folks who've worked hard, lived honestly, and played by the rules? It means we need to question some assumptions we've held our whole lives. That cash is safe, that government bonds are risk-free, that the system will always find a way to muddle through. It means paying attention to what's happening, not with panic, but with clear eyes. Watching for the signs, the way gold keeps climbing, the way wealthy people are quietly moving money, the way certain assets are behaving strangely. It means having honest conversations with family about what might be coming, about how to protect savings, about what real security looks like when the old definitions no longer apply. And it means remembering that, at the end of the day, real wealth has never been about numbers on a screen. It's about family, community, skills, relationships, land, things that have intrinsic value that matter whether the currency is strong or weak. The coming crisis is unlike 2008 because it's not a market failure. It's a currency failure. It's not about one sector collapsing. It's about the measuring stick itself becoming unreliable. But just like every crisis America has faced, we'll get through it. Not unchanged, we'll be different on the other side, but we'll endure, because we always have. The question is just whether we see it coming clearly enough to brace for impact, or whether we'll be caught completely off guard, waiting for a storm that's already arrived from a direction we weren't watching. My mother had it right all those years ago. Trouble rarely arrives wearing the same clothes twice. This isn't 2008 again. It's something new, something our generation hasn't seen before. But that doesn't mean we're helpless. Understanding is the first step. And if you've stayed with me this whole way, then you understand more than most. If you found this conversation helpful, or if it gave you something to chew on tonight, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps more folks our age find thoughtful, calm discussions like this one. And if you'd like to join me again, just hit subscribe so we can walk through these big changes together. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, does this moment feel different to you than 2008? What signs are you seeing in your own community? Are your children or grandchildren struggling with housing costs? Have you noticed the strange behavior in the markets? Your perspective matters here, and I always enjoy hearing your stories. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Stay informed, stay calm, and remember, we've been through hard times before, and we're still here. Thank you for your time today. It means more than you know.